Many warriors had survived, but all were wounded. They stood up and began to approach our boy, who was standing and looking at the ground. His attention was fixed on Jenagu and his eyes widened in surprise. He could not believe that she was saying it was very likely that Cumberland had not died. Jenagu, who had her forehead full of blood and her body full of scratches, began to gaze at the ground with a sad expression and nodded her head. According to her, it was likely that Cumberland was alive. Not far from the area was Agee's starship. Lushing turned around and began to observe it carefully. Jenagu revealed that Agee, the evil spear, left the martial saints on the brink of death and then locked them in his spaceship. But they could not break through the ship's defenses. While Lushing's eyes were shining with determination, he focused and began to stare at the ship, ready to attack. With a calm expression, Lushing attacked with a powerful cutting blast, which destroyed the ship's defenses as if nothing. The eyes of Jenagu and the others filled with surprise and their jaws dropped. They could not believe that Lushing had broken through the spaceship's defenses so easily. With a joyful gaze, Lushing began to observe his hand and couldn't help but smile. According to him, the ship's defenses were strong, but breaking them had been like cracking a nut with his hand. While his eyes were shining with confidence, he extended his hand toward the spaceship and, with a smile, entrusted Jenagu with the mission of rescuing the people, explaining that he had matters to attend to. With a surprised expression, Jenagu struck her fist against her hand and nodded her head. She couldn't believe that Lushing was so powerful. Without wasting any more time, Lushing took momentum and began to ascend into space. All the warriors bowed before our boy and respectfully bid farewell to Lord Lushing. While Lushing's eyes were shining with seriousness, he focused and began to fly quickly. Not long after, with his body surrounded by martial energy, Lushing reached space. Our boy began to observe the blue planet. Seeing that he was stronger than Agee, he came to the conclusion that Agee's leader must be a level 10 warrior, or at most level 11. But it was unlikely that the leader could surpass a level 11 warrior. With a serene gaze, Lushing extended his hand. His power had increased so exaggeratedly that not even he himself was clear on how strong he was now. He closed his eyes and let out a sigh, and remembered that in space there was no air. Breathing, for him, was no longer something necessary but had only become a habit. With a curious look, Lushing began to observe his hand carefully. He reflected that habits could change, like smoking or drinking, and with the reconstruction of his body in star form. In a certain sense, he had completely ceased to be human, having entered into a totally new level of existence. The space was filled with stars. It was beautiful. He could absorb the cosmic energy from the firmament and fully unfold his spiritual form. With eyes shining with determination, Lushing began to emit purple martial energy. Our boy clenched his fists tightly, and his body began to release a huge amount of energy. Compared to the blue star, Lushing's martial spirit was gigantic, and compared to the martial spirit, our boy was like a small ant. He imagined a palm the size of a planet descending from heaven and thought it would be a scene comparable to Buddha's palm subduing sun Wukong. He longed that maybe one day he could come to equal gods and Buddha. Lushing's martial spirit began to gaze to one side. Our boy found one of Agee's companions and hoped that warrior would be level 11. While Lushing's hand was releasing a suffocating aura, his eyes began to shine with excitement. According to him, killing that warrior by crushing him was going to be very boring. An evil smile spread across his face since according to him, for a normal person, it would not be satisfying to kill a mosquito. With a curious gaze, Lushing put his hand under his chin and began to ponder. He decided that, taking advantage of that time, he would reorganize himself a little and also review the supreme treasure that his master had given him. Lushing extended his hand and a small galaxy appeared in his hand, realizing that it was the seat of the material universe on some other civilized planet. It had already gotten dark. This planet looked like Egypt and was full of pyramids. Inside the pyramid, a large number of men bowed before someone in silence. In front of them was the chubby one floating, eating a meat drumstick and drinking a milkshake. Beneath him were treasure chests filled with energy crystals. Still with food remains on his cheek, with an evil gaze, the chubby one began to observe the men and, with an arrogant smile, asked if this was all they had. The king, who was prostrated before him, began to tremble in fear and promised that they had already delivered the entire collection of treasures from their royal house. The chubby one began to observe him in silence. The king had his face full of scratches and was bleeding, with eyes full of fear and desperation. He explained that they had only been able to gather this amount since the guide collected it once every 10 years. The chubby one grabbed the king by the neck. Upon seeing this, the king panicked and started screaming. While foam was emerging from the king's mouth, the chubby one's eyes began to shine with evil and he couldn't help but smile. He asked the king not to try to deceive him, revealing that he was the one who liked violence the least. He threw the king's body, making it crash against a pillar. With an arrogant smile, he decided to forget about this matter since it was almost time to leave. If he delayed a little more, he could end up losing against his friends. The king began to bleed and no longer had strength to move. With a worried expression, the king's daughter came running closer to see if he was okay. With a furious gaze, the father called his daughter stupid and asked why she had gone out, giving her the order to go back into hiding. Upon hearing this, the daughter's eyes filled with tears of sadness. At that moment, the chubby man's hands grabbed the princess by the waist. Upon feeling this, she couldn't help but fall into confusion. He couldn't help laughing like a madman. He couldn't believe that the king had said they no longer had good merchandise. With an evil gaze, he mentioned that the princess was of great value. Upon hearing this, her eyes filled with fear. She couldn't help but cry, knowing that she was in danger. A beam of light began to abduct the chubby one back to his ship. With an arrogant smile, he asked the princess to forget about this planet. With a gaze full of fear and desperation, she began to ask her father for help. The father extended his hand and could only scream and ask him to give his daughter back. Once the chubby one entered his ship, it took off and moved away from the planet. Inside the ship were chests full of energy crystals and the princess tied up and hanging from the ceiling. She closed her eyes and began to cry since according to her he was very cruel. The chubby one who was sitting in his seat contacted his friend using the system window and with a smile asked Ghost how things were on his side. With a serious gaze, Ghost mentioned that everything was going well. They were about to return, but they needed to pay AG a visit. Upon hearing this, the chubby one's mind filled with confusion. He began to gaze toward the window and asked if this was true. Ghost's eyes began to shine with seriousness. Showing a locator, he revealed that AG's signal was fluctuating. He had disappeared, but the spaceship remained in the same place. At the same time, Lushing went into dream space. While the zombies were wandering around, with a serene expression, Lushing began walking through the area. Green space was inside the seed, but the landscape was still as before. The only difference being that at base 1359 where the dream started, everything on this planet had disappeared, leaving only remains behind. Lushing put his hand on his chest and concentrated. He knew that everything that had happened in the past had been destroyed by his mentor and transformed into nutrients that had fused with his martial arts. Lushing activated the system. The ancient resource library still existed, and it was even more powerful. This was because it was no longer necessary to maintain those false images, deduce abilities, predict the future and explore resources, for that was the essence of the power of the resource library. With eyes shining with seriousness, Lushing began to imagine himself from the past, understanding that to speculate about the future, it was the power of the origin of the universe that was at work. The reason there had been a deviation before was simply because too little power from the origin had been mobilized. And the level explored was too superficial, which resulted in an incomplete deduction of information. Lushing began to look at his hand, and a strange energy started to emerge from it. He now possessed all the origin power of this planet, although that only represented such an insignificant amount of the total origin power of the universe that countless zeros would be needed before reaching. Lushing clenched his fists and his eyes began to shine with joy. If he wanted to reach level 16 or even higher in the future and truly wanted to save this universe from disaster, he had to completely refine the origin power of this universe. With an excited smile, Lushing struck his fist against his hand before he could clear a street or a base. But now what he needed was to clear planets one by one, and even planets throughout the entire universe. Since his 10 perfect martial arts required an enormous amount of origin accumulation, Lushing began to float through space with several planets beneath him. He had completely absorbed the essence of that planet, and he did not dare to imagine how magnificent it would be if that reach expanded to the universe, nor how powerful he would be if that day really came. Lushing began to gaze toward the ground, and a smile spread across his face. With an excited expression, Lushing clenched his fist. Perhaps he could truly become the symbolic representative of the word martial arts. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part. Not far from the area, there was another beautiful planet similar to the blue planet. With a serious expression, Lushing used his power and martial fire began to emerge from his eyes. Lushing extended his hands and with a smile began to release his power. His spiritual power was at level 11, although he had no idea what level his stellar martial body equaled. Lushing placed his hand on top of his chest, and his eyes widened with seriousness. He knew that his martial arts had also evolved greatly after merging with the paths of his masters, but it was impossible for him to clearly describe his current level. The gain had been immense, and fully assimilating it would require a long and deep process. Lushing's attention was fixed on one of the planets, and his eyes began to shine with joy, making a smile appear on his face. He decided to organize it as he advanced step by step on his. At that moment, Lushing's eyes were filled with seriousness, and his mind was filled with curiosity since something caught his attention. Not long after, his eyes began to shine with joy again, and a smile spread across his face upon noticing that another outsider was coming toward him. With an angry expression, he clenched his fist and decided to use them as guinea pigs for his experiments. In the vast stellar space, tens of thousands of light kilometers from the blue planet were the spaceships of the fat man and the long-haired man traveling at high speed toward his coordinates. While the fat man was eating another meat thigh, the long-haired man, who was sitting in a chair, began to observe him closely, called him Frando and asked what he thought about this matter. In Frando's spaceship was the princess lying on the floor, with her clothes torn. The fat man had already spent quite some time with her. He took a bite of his meat. Hi, and with a serene gaze mentioned that there was no choice but to go directly to where AG's trail had been lost. He speculated that maybe he had run into a patrol of star police and perhaps they had already killed him. The long-haired man couldn't help but smile, and his eyes began to shine with malice. According to him, if AG was dead, it would be good, since that way they wouldn't have to share the loot with him. Frando began to observe the system window and couldn't help but smile, explaining that in any case they should go take a look and report the situation to the boss, giving the order to depart. The spaceships activated the space jump and set course for the galaxy where Lushing's blue planet was located. Several minutes later, the ships arrived at the blue planet. With a joyful gaze, the long-haired man pressed the button of the ship and with a smile mentioned that this blue planet was really beautiful and decided to first activate the energy scan. The spaceship began to scan the blue planet. The man began to observe attentively, and the system revealed that it had detected an energy source of level 9 and above. Frando put his hand under his chin and with a confused gaze mentioned that this was strange. The attention of the long-haired man was fixed on the system window, and his mind was filled with curiosity. He did not know what was happening. Frando's face filled with sweat, and his eyes widened in fear, since he knew that AG's ship was clearly on the planet, but the scan showed no energy source of level 10 or higher. He wondered if AG had abandoned the ship and fled. The long-haired man's eyes widened with seriousness, and with a confident smile he made it clear that AG's death or escape didn't matter, as long as they weren't star police. The essential thing was to recover the ship in order to report. After saying this, he began to show an arrogant gaze. Upon hearing this, a smile appeared on Frando's face, since he thought that he was right. With an evil smile, Frando began to rub his hands. The eyes of the long-haired man began to shine with wickedness, and with a smile he mentioned that now they could also loot this planet. He began to imagine Jules and the members of his team as members of the infamous Crimson Eye Star pirate clan, known on several planets, were very cold. For them, the life or death of their companions did not matter at all. As long as their own life and money were safe, everything else was irrelevant. He stood up, walked away from the system panel, and with a smile decided to descend to the blue planet. Just then, the ship's system issued a notification. Upon hearing this, his attention was fixed on it and his eyes widened with curiosity. Once he turned around, the system began to scan the blue planet and revealed that a new energy source had been detected. The result of the initial scan had been incorrect, so a new scan was being performed. His eyes filled with confusion, as he did not know what was happening. Not long after, the system revealed that an energy source of level 10 or higher had been detected. The system started scanning again and revealed that a power source of 1110 or higher had been detected. Not long after, the system reported that the scan result was wrong, so a new scan was being performed. The system started going crazy. He placed his hands on the panel and with a confused gaze began to wonder why the system was failing. He turned around and with a serious expression informed Frando that his radar seemed to have detected a level 10 warrior. Upon hearing this, Frando felt confused since his system had not detected anything, while his eyes were shining. With confidence, he began to shake his head, extended his hands, and with a smile explained to Gishi that in such a miserable place as this one, it was impossible for a level 10 warrior to appear, so it surely was a system failure. Just then, Frando's eyes filled with curiosity and confusion as something caught his attention. Behind the blue planet, a powerful martial energy began to emerge. Not long after, a giant star in the shape of a sun appeared behind the blue planet. The attention of Frando and Gishi was fixed on it, their eyes filled with fear, and their jaws dropped in confusion. They did not know what was happening. The star passed over the blue planet and began to approach at great speed toward their spaceships. Frando and Gishi panicked, realizing that it was the sun. With eyes full of fear, Gishi swallowed saliva and began to sweat like crazy. He wondered what was happening, since a star so close to a habitable planet could not be something normal. Frando began to sweat like a madman, and with a furious gaze he realized that it was not a star, but some kind of divine martial ability. The sun began to expand and little by little it started to explode. Frando's attention fixed on it and his mind filled with fear. Upon realizing that there was a human silhouette inside the star. Once the sun exploded, Lu Xing emerged with his body surrounded by martial fire and began to advance toward them. His eyes began to shine with excitement and a smile spread across his face. He made it clear that, in front of the blue planet, space trash was forbidden from passing through. Frando began to lose his mind, and with a nervous gaze started shouting, asking Gishi to flee. He felt confused since he didn't know what was happening. They turned on their spaceships and without hesitating for a second, they turned their backs on the blue planet and began to flee. Frando, who was controlling his spaceship, clenched his teeth and felt furious. At that moment, he understood the terrible truth about AG's death, realizing that they were facing a true monster. With a look full of fear, he turned toward Lu Xing, realizing that he had at least the power of an 11th level warrior. Immediately, he decided to make a space jump to escape and return to inform the chief. While little by little their spaceships were moving away, Lu Xing began to observe attentively. In silence, Lu Xing extended his hand toward them, and while his eyes were shining with excitement, he activated his mental power and could not help but smile. Now that they had arrived, it was clear there was no reason to leave now. Lu Xing's martial energy began to take effect and little by little Frando began to bleed from the mouth. With a confused gaze full of fear, he realized that this was martial power. Gishi began to vomit blood and his eyes widened in terror, realizing that this was the spiritual power of a level 11 warrior. Not long after, Frando collapsed to the ground, wondering who that spiritual warrior with such immense power really was. At that moment, with his body surrounded by blue martial energy, Lu Xing appeared on his ship and began to observe him silently with a curious gaze. Thar Boi began to stare intently at Frando with a piercing expression. For him, those below level 11 were as easy to eliminate as cutting grass. He barely touched their souls and extinguished them immediately. He realized that, without noticing it, he had grown to that level. At the same time, aboard the claw of the Star Pirate clan, deep in distant space, there was a man with purple hair sitting with his hand resting on his head and sunk in his thoughts. He was the Crimson Eye, the leader of the Star Pirates. His eyes began to shine with rage, since Gishi and Frando had also lost contact. A woman with brown hair who was holding a tray with a glass appeared, and upon hearing this, her eyes filled with confusion. The leader turned toward her and began to observe her in silence. He stood up and, with a curious gaze, activated the spaceship's system, causing it to start showing the blue planet. He couldn't believe that a small planet with level 1 resources had managed to make Gishi and the others, 3 level 10 warriors, disappear without a trace. The woman crossed her arms and, with a confused expression, thought it was the work of the Star Police. The leader's eyes began to shine seriously. For him, it was not very likely that it was about the Star Police, because even if a large contingent arrived, his men would not have stopped sending at least one signal. Most likely they had been eliminated in an instant. Upon hearing this, her eyes filled with fear and she couldn't help but panic. With an uncertain expression, the leader decided to go take a look. With eyes full of terror and concern, she also decided to go with him. The leader's eyes began to shine with evil and a smile spread across his face. He felt calm as he believed he had an ace up his sleeve. Even if a level 11 warrior at their peak came to catch him, he trusted in having the strength to come out unscathed. They had lost 3 people for no reason at all. Something that had never happened before, so he had to find out what had happened. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,